George Jones' story is one of talent, tragedy, and financial ruin, but it's also a lesson. Know your worth. Don't sign away your rights just because someone waves a check in your face. Surround yourself with honest people. Managers, accountants, and lawyers can make or break you. Keep control of your earnings. What happened to Jones happens to countless musicians who don't pay attention to where their money is going. Jones left behind a legacy of timeless music, but he also left behind a cautionary tale for every artist trying to make it in the industry. His voice will live forever, but the fortune he should have had, that was stolen from him. And that's the shocking truth about George Jones' lost millions. Think this is just a problem from the past? Think again. Modern musicians are still getting ripped off. Only now the game has changed. Instead of shady record deals, artists are getting robbed through low streaming royalties, hidden fees, and contracts that still take most of their money before they ever see a dime. The sad truth? The industry has always been set up to make everyone except the artist rich. Over his lifetime, Jones generated well over $100 million in music sales, tours, and royalties. Yet, by the time he passed in 2013, his estate was worth just $2.5 million. Where did it all go? Record labels took the biggest cuts from his early music. Fraudulent managers stole millions. Bad contracts meant lost royalties on hit songs. His assets were seized and sold at government auctions. Even worse, over 200 unreleased recordings, potentially worth millions today, were sold off for cheap just to keep him afloat financially. His own family can't even afford to buy back his memorabilia because the value skyrocketed after his death. In the late 80s, Jones made a massive comeback with He Stopped Loving Her Today, one of the most iconic country songs ever recorded. The song put him back on top and was bringing in about $3 million a year. But here's the kicker. 70% of his income was already spoken for, going toward debts and repayments. New contracts gave record labels control over his merchandise and royalties. Even at his peak, most of his earnings were going anywhere but his own pocket. He should have been back in millionaire status, but instead, he was still struggling to break even. Jones' financial troubles hit rock bottom in 1981, when the IRS came knocking. Years of unpaid taxes had caught up with him, and the government wasn't playing around. He owed over $6 million in back taxes. The IRS seized everything, his mansion, cars, even his gold records. His prized possessions were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Just like that, one of country music's greatest legends was left with almost nothing. And while he'd later rebuild his career, he would never fully recover financially. As if bad contracts and reckless spending weren't enough, Jones was also being flat out robbed by the very people who were supposed to manage his finances. His business manager, accountant, and lawyers secretly set up fake companies. They inflated invoices to siphon off his money. They tricked him into signing over royalty rights to shell companies they controlled. The estimated damage? $5 million stolen, which, when adjusted for today's money, is about $25 million. By the time Jones figured it out, it was too late. The money was gone, and so were the people who took it. By the late 70s, Jones' financial troubles were already piling up. So what did he do? He built a 1,000-acre estate in Texas, known as the Possum Palace. It was supposed to be his dream home, but in reality, it became an endless financial burden. The mansion itself cost $2.4 million, about $13 million today. He spent $200,000 per month on upkeep. It had a private zoo, a recording studio, and even a runway for private planes. Here's the problem. While the expenses were astronomical, his actual earnings weren't keeping up. Instead of making him money, the mansion drained his finances. In 1965, George signed what seemed like a great contract at the time. The problem? He didn't realize the fine print gave away his rights to his own music forever. Imagine this. His hit song White Lightning raked in over $1 million in revenue. Jones? He got just enough to cover his expenses. Labels, managers, and industry insiders walked away with a real payday, while the man who wrote and performed the song barely got crumbs. This wasn't just one bad deal. This was a norm in the industry back then. Jones, like many artists, trusted the wrong people, and those people made sure they got rich while he struggled. Back in the 1950s and 60s, George Jones was climbing the ranks of country music. By 1980, he was making over $5 million a year. That's over $18 million today, when adjusted for inflation. A superstar of his caliber should have been set for life. But here's the catch. Thanks to predatory contracts and shady industry deals, Jones was barely scraping by. Some reports say he was losing up to 90% of his earnings due to bad agreements signed early in his career. Let that sink in. The man was generating millions, yet a staggering amount of that money was disappearing before he even saw it. George Jones was one of the greatest country singers of all time. His voice, his storytelling, and his legendary status are undeniable. But while his music made millions, he barely saw a fraction of it. By the time he passed in 2013, his estate was shockingly small compared to the fortune he should have had. How did a man who sold millions of records, packed concert halls, and created some of country music's most iconic hits end up losing so much money? Buckle up, because this is a wild ride of bad contracts, shady managers, reckless spending, and outright fraud that left the Possum struggling financially, despite being one of the most successful country artists in history.